a billionaire disguises himself as a broke Keke driver, determined to find one woman who could love him without knowing his fortune. He believes Chloe, a street food vendor barely surviving, is the only one who passes his test. But the night he finally confesses his real name, she looks at him without a flicker of surprise and says, "I've known who you are since the very first day." Tucked inside her worn bag sits an old photograph tied to his own family. Proof their meeting may never have been an accident at all. If stories about real love hiding behind unexpected disguises pull you in the way this one is about to, hit subscribe now so you never miss the next one. Ethan Kane grew up believing that money could buy almost anything except the one thing he wanted most. He had inherited more than he could ever spend, a name that opened doors before he even knocked, and a life that looked perfect from the outside. Yet every woman who smiled at him seemed to be counting zeros behind her eyes. One had told him she loved him after only 2 dates, then asked for enough money to send her brother abroad. Another had cried about her family's struggles, only for him to later find out the cash he gave her had gone straight into a jewelry store. By the time he turned 30, Ethan no longer knew if anyone could look at him and see a man instead of a fortune. That doubt eventually hardened into a plan. Ethan decided he would disappear from his own life for a while, not through some grand announcement, but quietly, the way a man slips out of a room without anyone noticing he is gone. He shortened his name to just Kane, the kind of name that sounded like it belonged to nobody important. He traded his tailored shirts for faded t-shirts, his leather shoes for cheap rubber sandals, and used a small portion of his own money to buy a battered old tuk-tuk that rattled every time it hit a pothole. He moved into a narrow rented room above a hardware store, the kind of place he had never once considered livable. For the first time in his adult life, Ethan wanted to be invisible because invisibility was the only way he could ever know if someone loved the man underneath the name. On the other side of the city, Chloe Bennett had never had the luxury of choosing invisibility. She sold food from a small cart every day, waking before sunrise to prepare what she could afford, and staying out until the last customer wandered off into the night. Her mother, Grace Bennett, had been sick for years, and the medicine alone ate up more than half of what Chloe earned in a good week. She was not ashamed of the life she lived. Even when others looked at her cart and her worn sandals with quiet pity, what she carried instead was a stubborn kind of pride, the sort that refused to let poverty become an excuse for cutting corners or lowering her own standards. Chloe also carried something else, tucked carefully at the bottom of an old canvas bag she never let out of her sight. Years earlier, Grace had worked as a cook inside the Kane family estate, back when the halls were quieter and the family name had not yet become a fixture in every business magazine in the country. Among Grace's few keepsakes was a faded photograph of the Kane household, taken during a holiday gathering, with a much younger Ethan standing stiffly beside his parents. Chloe had grown up hearing stories about that house, about the boy in the photograph who probably had no idea a cook's daughter still kept his childhood face folded inside a plastic sleeve. She had seen that same face again more recently, this time staring out from the cover of a business magazine at a newsstand, the headline calling him the reluctant heir of the Kane empire. So when a battered tuk-tuk pulled up one evening and the driver introduced himself simply as Kane, something in Chloe's memory clicked into place before he had even finished his sentence. She recognized the eyes first, then the faint scar near his eyebrow that no amount of dirt on his face could hide. The man was clearly trying very hard to be someone he was not, and Chloe found herself more curious than alarmed by the sight of it. The evening that changed everything started the way most of Ethan's evenings had gone lately, with a passenger complaining about the road, the heat, or the price of the ride. He had learned quickly that people treated a tuk-tuk driver the way they might treat furniture, useful only for as long as it served a purpose and easily discarded the moment it became inconvenient. Some passengers barked orders without a single word of thanks. Others tried to shortchange him and dared him to argue, knowing full well that a driver like him could not afford to lose a paying customer over a few coins. Ethan absorbed all of it silently, telling himself this was exactly the education he needed. Chloe climbed into his tuk-tuk that night carrying 2 stacked containers of food balanced carefully on her knees, the smell of fried plantain and pepper soup drifting through the cramped cabin. Halfway through the ride, another passenger crammed in beside her began mocking Ethan for taking the long way, accusing him of trying to inflate the fare. Chloe cut in before Ethan could even open his mouth, telling the man sharply that the road was full of craters and any driver with sense would avoid breaking an axle over a shortcut. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made the other passenger fall quiet for the rest of the ride, and Ethan felt something unfamiliar loosen in his chest. When they finally reached her stop, Ethan tried to wave off the fare, telling her the ride was on him after what she had done. Chloe refused outright, pressing the exact amount into his palm and closing his fingers around it with her own. She told him that a man who works deserves to be paid for his work, no more and no less, and that shortcuts around fairness had a way of catching up with people eventually. It was such a small thing, an ordinary transaction between a driver and a passenger, yet Ethan sat there afterward feeling as though someone had finally looked at him and seen a person instead of a wallet. Chloe walked the rest of the way home with her empty containers clattering softly against each other, her mind circling back again and again to the man behind the wheel. Once she reached the small room she shared with her mother, she set her bag down and pulled out the old photograph, studying the boy's face beside the tuk-tuk drivers in her memory until there was no more room for doubt. She understood now exactly who Kane really was, and the question that kept her awake that night was not whether she should say something, but why a man with everything would choose to live with nothing. She decided, almost without meaning to, that she would not say a word. Part of her reasoning was practical. If she confronted him immediately, he would likely assume she was just another woman angling for his money, and that assumption would end things before they had even properly begun. Part of it was more personal, a genuine need to understand why someone would give up comfort to chase something as uncertain as unconditional love. And part of it, though she was slower to admit this to herself, was curiosity about whether the kindness she had witnessed on that ride was real or simply a performance meant to be discovered later. Whatever the reason, Chloe made a quiet decision that night to let the mystery unfold on its own terms. From that point forward, both of them were living inside a kind of unspoken agreement neither had actually spoken aloud. Ethan believed he was the only one holding a secret, carefully measuring every interaction to see if Chloe's warmth would eventually curdle into demands. Chloe, meanwhile, was holding a secret of her own, watching him just as closely, though for entirely different reasons. Neither of them said anything about it, and for a while, the silence between them felt less like deception and more like two people cautiously circling the same small fire. Over the following weeks, Ethan found reasons to drive past Chloe's usual selling spot more often than his actual work required. He told himself it was simply good business, since she was a reliable customer who tipped fairly and never haggled over fares. In truth, he had started looking forward to the sight of her cart long before he reached the corner where she worked, and he noticed the exact moment each evening when she began packing up her unsold food to carry home. Through these repeated rides, he learned that Grace's illness had worn a permanent groove into Chloe's daily schedule, dictating when she could sell, when she needed to rush home with medicine, and when she simply had no choice but to keep working despite exhaustion. What struck Ethan most was not the hardship itself, since he had expected to encounter poverty when he first devised his plan, but the way Chloe carried it without asking anyone for pity. She never mentioned her mother's condition as a way of fishing for sympathy or assistance, and when Ethan once offered to help cover a bill, she quietly declined, saying she preferred to manage what she could handle on her own. He began to understand, in a way that no boardroom lecture on corporate responsibility had ever taught him, that being poor did not mean lacking dignity, and that the two things had nothing to do with one another. The recognition unsettled him a little, because it meant the divide he had always assumed existed between his world and people like Chloe was far thinner than he had imagined. Chloe, for her part, was undergoing her own quiet reassessment. She had expected that a man playing at poverty would eventually slip, complaining about a scraped knuckle or a long shift, in a way that revealed he had never truly needed to work a day in his life. Instead, she watched him wait in fuel lines for hours under a punishing sun, argue with mechanics who tried to overcharge him for a simple repair, and absorb insult after insult from passengers without ever once threatening to reveal who he really was. It became harder to write off his kindness as a temporary performance when the performance never seemed to end, even in moments when no one was watching closely enough to notice or care. One evening, wanting to test the limits of what he had built between them, Ethan told Chloe that he was behind on payments for the tuk-tuk and might lose the vehicle entirely within the week. It was not entirely a lie, since he had structured his disguise carefully enough that losing the vehicle really would strand him without an easy way to maintain the ruse, but the desperation in his tone was performed more than felt. He watched her face for any flicker of calculation, any hint that she might offer to help in exchange for something later, the way so many women in his past had done the moment they sensed an opening. Chloe did not offer him money, because she did not have any worth offering. Instead, without a second of hesitation, she reached into her bag and handed him one of the 2 containers of food she had been planning to eat that night, telling him simply that an empty stomach made every problem feel heavier than it actually was. She sat beside him while he ate, not asking a single question about how he planned to solve the payment issue, as though his hunger in that moment mattered more to her than whatever crisis loomed the next day. Ethan sat there with the warm container in his hands, acutely aware that he had just watched someone give away part of her own dinner without calculating anything in return. That small act settled something in him that weeks of careful observation had not fully resolved. He found himself thinking, with a kind of quiet certainty he had not felt in years, that he might finally have found the woman his entire disguise had been designed to find. At the same time, he still had not told her the truth, and a part of him wondered whether he was allowed to feel this certain about someone he was still actively deceiving. Chloe felt her own feelings shifting in a direction she had not fully planned for either. What had started as curiosity about a billionaire playing dress-up had slowly become something that had very little to do with his money at all. She caught herself looking forward to his tuk-tuk pulling up at the end of a long day, not because of any material comfort he offered, but because of the particular way he listened when she spoke about her mother, as though the details actually mattered to him rather than serving as background noise before he moved on to something more interesting. The trouble was that her growing feelings made the secret she was keeping heavier with every passing day. She understood, with increasing clarity, that continuing to say nothing was no longer just an act of patient observation, but something closer to a lie of omission that could unravel everything the moment he found out on his own. Still, when she imagined telling him the truth outright, she pictured his expression shifting instantly into suspicion, the same way it must have shifted every time a previous woman revealed she had known more than she let on. That fear was enough to keep her quiet a little longer, even as the weight of the secret pressed harder against her conscience. Standing at that particular crossroads, Chloe made a choice that would shape everything that followed. She chose to keep pretending she knew nothing, not out of malice or greed, but out of a genuine fear that honesty would cost her the very thing she was beginning to want most. It was a decision born of love rather than deception in her own mind, though she understood even then that Ethan would likely see it very differently if he ever discovered how long she had known. With that choice made, she stepped further into a relationship built on 2 unspoken truths, hoping that whatever they were building together would prove strong enough to survive the moment those truths finally came out into the open. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself trusting Chloe in ways he had never trusted anyone outside his own family. Yet trust, once it starts growing, tends to notice even the smallest cracks in its own foundation, and Ethan began noticing things about Chloe that did not quite fit the story of a woman who knew nothing about his real life. She once mentioned the name of a street near the Kane estate without ever having been told where he actually lived, catching herself only after the words had already left her mouth. Another time, she glanced at a delivery truck bearing the Kane Company logo, and her eyes lingered a beat too long, as though she were reading something written on it that Ethan himself had not pointed out. The strangest moment came one evening when Ethan casually mentioned his father's temper, and Chloe replied by calling him Ethan instead of Kane, catching herself almost instantly, her cheeks coloring as though the slip had surprised even her. Ethan let it pass without comment, but the seed of doubt had already been planted, and it grew a little more every time he noticed her flinch slightly whenever the topic of his family came up in conversation. He began to wonder whether the woman he had come to care for so deeply actually knew far more than she let on, and whether her kindness toward him had been built on a foundation of knowledge rather than the blind acceptance he had been searching for. What made the doubt so difficult to resolve was that Chloe's actions never once matched the profile of someone chasing his fortune. She still refused any money that felt like more than a fair payment for a fair service. She still shared her food with him on nights when his manufactured stories of hardship grew more elaborate, testing her without mercy in ways he was beginning to feel slightly ashamed of. She never asked about his family's wealth, never hinted at wanting a future beyond the modest one a tuk-tuk driver could realistically offer her. Ethan found himself caught between two contradictory pictures of the same woman, unable to reconcile the small, suspicious details with the overwhelming pattern of her generosity. The tension reached a breaking point when Grace took a sudden turn for the worse, her breathing growing shallow enough that even a neighbor with no medical training could tell something serious was happening. Ethan quietly arranged for medication that cost far more than any tuk-tuk driver could realistically produce on short notice, telling Chloe afterward that a passenger who worked at a pharmacy had given it to him as a favor. Chloe accepted the medicine because her mother's life mattered more than pressing him on a story that clearly did not add up, but she recognized immediately that no favor from a stranger explained pills that expensive appearing overnight. The gap between what he claimed and what he was clearly capable of only confirmed, once again, everything she had already known since their very first ride together. Ethan could feel himself reaching the limit of how long he could keep living inside a lie that had started to feel less like a test and more like a betrayal of the very trust he claimed to be searching for. One evening, after Grace had stabilized enough for both of them to breathe a little easier, Ethan asked Chloe to meet him somewhere quiet, away from the noise of her usual selling spot and the constant interruptions of paying passengers. Chloe agreed without asking why, though something in his tone told her that whatever conversation was coming had been building for a very long time. They sat together on a low wall overlooking the water as the evening settled into darkness, and Ethan finally said the words he had rehearsed so many times in his head that they came out flatter than he intended. He told her his real name was Ethan Kane, that his family controlled one of the largest companies in the country, and that the tuk-tuk, the rented room, and the entire persona of Kane had all been an elaborate test designed to find a woman capable of loving him without knowing any of that. He watched her face closely, bracing himself for shock, anger, or perhaps the kind of wounded betrayal he had seen in every previous relationship the moment money entered the conversation. Chloe simply looked at him and said she already knew. She reached into her worn canvas bag and pulled out the old photograph, holding it steady in the fading light so he could see his own younger face staring back at him from beside his parents. She explained that her mother had once cooked in the Kane household years earlier, long before either of them had any reason to cross paths again, and that she had recognized him the very first night he stepped into her line of sight as a passenger rather than a driver. Ethan felt something inside him go cold and hollow all at once, the sensation of an entire foundation cracking beneath a structure he had spent months carefully building. He demanded to know whether she had approached him because she already knew who he was, whether every kindness had been calculated rather than genuine, whether she had simply been waiting for him to confess so she could finally step into a life of comfort she had been engineering from the start. He wanted an answer that made sense of everything, some explanation that would let him separate what was real from what had merely been performance. Chloe told him plainly that their meeting had been an accident, nothing more than an ordinary passenger stepping into an ordinary tuk-tuk on an ordinary night. She admitted she had chosen silence because she feared he would immediately lump her together with every other woman who had ever tried to use him, the moment he realized she had recognized him from the beginning. She also admitted, with a directness that startled him, that she had wanted to see for herself whether a man born into that much wealth could actually treat poor people with real respect, or whether his disguise was simply another kind of performance meant to be discarded once it had served its purpose. She told him that he had wanted to know whether she could love a poor man, while she had wanted to know whether he could genuinely respect one, and that both of their tests had been running side by side the entire time without either of them fully realizing it. The observation landed heavier than any accusation could have, because it forced Ethan to confront the fact that he had never once considered himself the subject of anyone else's scrutiny throughout the entire experiment. He had assumed, without ever examining the assumption, that he alone held the power to judge and be judged in this relationship, and Chloe's words dismantled that assumption in a single sentence. Ethan walked away from that conversation without any clear resolution, his mind too tangled to decide whether he had been deceived or simply misunderstood. Chloe let him go, understanding that whatever trust existed between them had just been tested in a way neither of them had anticipated, and that chasing after him would only prove less about her sincerity than standing still and letting him work through the truth on his own terms. In the days that followed, Ethan found himself circling back, again and again, to the small moments he had witnessed over the past several months. He remembered the times Chloe had helped him without anyone else watching, the meals she had shared despite having little to spare herself, the countless occasions she had refused money that would have made her life measurably easier. None of those moments made sense if her only goal had been to eventually claim a share of his fortune, and slowly Ethan allowed himself to separate the fact that she had lied about what she knew from the deeper fact that she had never once acted on that knowledge for her own benefit. When Ethan finally returned to her, the two of them agreed, without needing to say it explicitly, that whatever came next would have to be built without any further secrets between them. Ethan wanted his family to meet Chloe properly, not as a curiosity or a rumor, but as the woman he intended to build a real future with, regardless of how that decision might be received inside the walls of the Kane estate. Chloe agreed, though a quiet unease settled over her the moment they set a date, since she understood better than Ethan did just how differently wealthy families sometimes treated the truth depending on who was telling it. The dinner at the Kane estate went badly from the very first exchange of pleasantries. Ethan's parents had already heard rumors about a woman from the street market, and their disapproval only sharpened when Ethan admitted, with a foolish sense of honesty he later regretted, that Chloe had recognized him from the very beginning of their relationship. His father's expression shifted from polite skepticism into something colder and far more calculating, and it did not take long before the accusations started forming into full sentences rather than suspicious glances. Mr. Kane told the table plainly that a woman who knowingly courted a billionaire while pretending to believe he was poor had not stumbled into anything by accident, and that her refusal to take money only proved she was patient enough to wait for a far larger prize down the line. He argued that the old photograph Chloe carried was not evidence of an innocent coincidence, but proof that she had recognized an opportunity the moment it walked into her cart, and had spent months carefully building the image of a selfless woman precisely because she understood how convincing that image would eventually become. No explanation Chloe offered seemed to make a dent in his certainty, and Ethan watched helplessly as every gesture of kindness Chloe had ever shown him got reinterpreted piece by piece as evidence of a long and patient con. Ethan stood at a crossroads that felt far more consequential than any decision he had made since the day he first climbed into that battered tuk-tuk. He could side with his father's version of events, a version that offered him the comfort of returning fully to the life he had always known, or he could trust the months of evidence his own eyes had gathered about who Chloe truly was. In the end, he chose Chloe, telling his father plainly that he would not abandon the one person who had never once asked him for anything beyond fair treatment. His father's response was immediate and far heavier than Ethan had prepared for. It was not simply a matter of losing a title or a set of keys, since Ethan had already given most of that up on his own months earlier. Instead, Mr. Kane moved to cut Ethan off from the family entirely, quietly instructing every business contact in his network to refuse Ethan work of any kind, and pressuring the owner of the hardware store to raise the rent on the small room until it was no longer affordable. Doors that had once opened for Ethan simply because of his last name now closed just as quickly for the very same reason, and for the first time since the disguise began, the hardship around him was no longer something he had chosen. Ethan and Chloe were forced out of the narrow room they had grown used to and into something smaller still, a single space above a shuttered shop on the edge of the district, with barely enough room for a mattress and a stove. Ethan kept driving the tuk-tuk each day, waking before dawn and returning long after dark, absorbing the same insults and long fuel lines he once treated as a temporary experiment, but now had to survive as an actual necessity, made harder by a father determined to make sure no other work would ever come easily to his son again. Chloe watched him come home each night more exhausted than the last, and she began to believe, with a growing and painful certainty, that her old secret had somehow poisoned the well before their relationship even had a real chance to prove itself to his family. It was during those first difficult weeks in the smaller room, not long after the dinner at the estate but before his father's full campaign against them had fully taken hold, that Chloe became pregnant, though neither of them would realize it until well over a month later. Mr. Kane, unwilling to let the matter rest, eventually offered Ethan a way back into the family fold. He would restore everything Ethan had lost, provided his son ended things with Chloe permanently, and agreed instead to marry Vanessa Sterling, the daughter of a business partner, whose family connections mattered far more to the Kane Company than any question of love. Ethan refused outright, telling his father he would rather drive a tuk-tuk for the rest of his life than trade Chloe for a marriage built entirely on convenience and ledger sheets. Around this same time, Chloe finally understood why she had been feeling unwell for weeks, and the realization landed on her not as joy but as an unbearable new weight added to an already precarious situation. She began to believe that her silence at the very start of their relationship was the true source of everything that had gone wrong since, reasoning that if she had simply told Ethan the truth from the beginning, his family might never have had a reason to distrust her so completely. Convinced that Ethan would never willingly abandon her on his own, and unwilling to watch him lose his entire future over a decision she felt responsible for causing, Chloe began quietly considering a plan that would force his hand instead of waiting for circumstances to resolve themselves. She understood that pleading with him to return to his family would accomplish nothing, since Ethan had already proven, again and again, that he would choose her over comfort every single time she asked directly. If she wanted to save his future, she would have to take the choice out of his hands entirely, using the one thing she knew could genuinely break his trust in her, instead of simply asking for his forgiveness. It was a plan built entirely on self-sacrifice, though Chloe herself understood, even as she began forming it in her mind, that it would require her to become, however briefly, the very thing his father had already accused her of being. Chloe waited until the evening had settled into its usual quiet before she said the words she had spent days preparing herself to say. She told Ethan that his father had been right about her from the very beginning, that she had known exactly who he was the first night he stepped into her tuk-tuk, and that she had stayed close to him all this time because she believed a man with his fortune would eventually return to the life he came from, bringing her along with him. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, forcing herself not to soften the words even as every instinct in her body screamed at her to take them back. Ethan refused to accept what he was hearing, reminding her of every meal she had shared with him, every night she had sat beside him while he pretended to face some invented crisis, every ride she had paid for in full when she could have easily talked her way out of it. Chloe pushed forward anyway, telling him that all of it had simply been a more convincing performance than any other woman had managed before, precisely because she understood that patience would eventually earn her more than desperation ever could. The words tasted like poison in her mouth, but she made herself finish the sentence, watching something break behind Ethan's eyes, as the accusation his father had made now seemed to be confirmed by the one person who mattered most. Ethan left the small room without another word, and Chloe did not follow him. She sat alone for a long time afterward, then finally broke down in front of Grace, admitting through tears that she had lied to save Ethan's future rather than her own, though she no longer felt entirely certain the sacrifice had been worth what it cost. Grace said nothing in response beyond holding her daughter's hand, understanding that some decisions could not be undone simply by wishing them different. Ethan returned to his family within the week, and his father wasted no time finalizing the arrangement he had been pushing for all along. The engagement to Vanessa Sterling was announced almost immediately, and the wedding that followed was lavish in every way. A Kane family event was expected to be, filled with cameras, business partners, and toasts about a partnership built for the future of both companies. Ethan stood through the entire ceremony feeling as though he were watching someone else's life unfold around him, going through motions that meant nothing while the one relationship that had ever felt real to him sat somewhere across the city, cut off completely from the world he had just stepped back into. Chloe, meanwhile, spent the months that followed carrying a pregnancy she told no one outside her own home about. She reasoned that revealing it now, with Ethan already married to someone else, would only confirm every suspicion his father had voiced at that terrible dinner, making her look exactly like the calculating woman she had convinced Ethan she was in order to push him away. So she said nothing, continuing to sell food from her cart each day, her condition growing harder to hide only as the months wore on, and her body changed in ways loose clothing could no longer fully disguise. She carried the truth alone because she saw no version of the future where speaking it would help anyone. The marriage between Ethan and Vanessa unraveled with a speed that surprised even the household staff who had seen plenty of unhappy arranged unions over the years. Vanessa spent money with no apparent limit, treated the household employees with open contempt, and made it clear through both words and actions that she cared far more about the Kane name than about the man who carried it. She leaned heavily on her father's business connections to influence decisions inside the Kane company itself, positioning herself less as a wife and more as a permanent extension of her own family's interests. Ethan watched the marriage collapse in slow motion, recognizing in painful detail everything Chloe's presence had once offered him that this arrangement never could. It was Mr. Kane himself who first crossed paths with Chloe again, several months later, entirely by accident, while passing through the same street market where her cart still stood every evening. He noticed her condition before he noticed her face, and his first instinct was suspicion, assuming this pregnancy was simply the next phase of a scheme he believed she had been running since the very beginning. He confronted her directly, demanding to know whose child she was carrying, and Chloe, too tired to keep dodging the question, admitted plainly that the children were Ethan's. What stopped Mr. Kane from dismissing her outright was a detail that did not fit the story he had already convinced himself was true. If Chloe had truly been chasing the Kane fortune all along, she had every reason to come forward the moment she learned she was pregnant, using the child as leverage to secure support, recognition, or a place inside the family. Instead, she had said nothing for months, continuing to work her cart alone, asking for nothing from a family that had already publicly humiliated her. The gap between what a calculating woman would have done and what Chloe had actually done began, for the first time, to trouble him in a way none of her earlier explanations ever had. Grace, who by then had recovered enough from her illness to walk to the market with the help of a cane, was present for part of the conversation and finally told Mr. Kane everything Chloe had never fully explained to anyone in his family. She described how her daughter had recognized Ethan from the very first ride but had never once sought him out or planned the meeting in advance. How real feelings had grown between them long before either of them spoke openly about money or family names, and how the cruel words Chloe had said the night Ethan left had been a deliberate lie, meant to push him back toward the family he was about to lose entirely. She explained that Chloe had hidden the pregnancy out of fear, that revealing it would only make her look exactly like the woman Mr. Kane already believed her to be. Mr. Kane sat with this new information longer than he expected to, turning over the logic of it until he arrived at a conclusion he had never allowed himself to consider before. He recognized that his own assumptions about poverty and character had led him to read every one of Chloe's silences as evidence of calculation, when in fact, those same silences had been born from fear of exactly the judgment he had been so quick to deliver. It was an uncomfortable realization for a man who had spent his entire career trusting his instincts about people, and it left him quietly resolved to correct a mistake before it grew any larger than it already had. Without telling his son anything yet, Mr. Kane arranged for Chloe to be moved somewhere safer, ensuring she had proper medical care and support through the remaining weeks of her pregnancy. He kept his distance from Ethan's collapsing marriage in the meantime, unwilling to further complicate matters until he understood exactly how to undo the damage his earlier judgment had caused. The silence between father and son continued a little while longer, though it now carried a different weight than before, filled less with certainty and more with a man quietly reconsidering everything he thought he knew. Chloe gave birth to 3 children, a boy and 2 girls, in a hospital room far removed from the noise of the Kane estate. It was Ethan's mother, Diane Kane, who finally brought him there, telling him only that there was something he needed to see for himself, rather than explaining the situation in advance. Ethan walked into the room and found Chloe sitting up in bed with 3 small bundles beside her, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, the silence carrying more meaning than either of them could have put into words. Chloe finally spoke, telling him plainly that she had known he was a billionaire since the very first night, but that she had never loved the billionaire version of him at all. She told him she had fallen for the man who waited for her in the rain, who helped her carry heavy pots of food without being asked, who treated her mother's illness as though it mattered as much as anything happening in his own family's boardrooms. Ethan asked her, still trying to make sense of everything at once, why she had ever told him she only cared about his money if none of that was true. Chloe answered that it had been the only lie cruel enough to actually make him leave, the only words sharp enough to cut through everything he had come to believe about her. Ethan sat with that answer for a long moment, recognizing at last that he had chosen to trust his own oldest fear over months of evidence his own eyes had gathered about who Chloe truly was. Yet Chloe did not let herself off easily either, admitting in the same breath that she had made too many decisions on his behalf without ever giving him the chance to choose for himself. From the earliest silence about recognizing him, to the decision to push him back toward his family, to hiding an entire pregnancy rather than trusting him with the truth. Both of them recognized, sitting together in that quiet hospital room, that they had each tried to protect the other through silence rather than honesty, and that the very love driving those choices had ended up causing far more pain than either version of the truth ever could have. It was not a moment of instant forgiveness so much as a moment of finally seeing each other clearly, without disguises, without lies told for someone else's benefit, and without any more secrets left standing between them. Mr. Kane arrived at the hospital not long after, having finally decided the time had come to correct his mistake publicly rather than privately. He apologized to Chloe directly, acknowledging that he had judged her character based entirely on her poverty rather than her actions, and he announced to the rest of the family that the 3 children were his grandchildren, refusing to hide Chloe or her children from anyone connected to the Kane name any longer. When Vanessa's father threatened to pull his investments and cancel every contract between the 2 families in response, Mr. 5, Kane chose his son's happiness over the business arrangement without hesitation, and the marriage between Ethan and Vanessa was dissolved shortly afterward, with Vanessa leaving the family entirely once she understood that no amount of money could force a man to love her. Chloe forgave Ethan, though she made clear she would not simply fall back into his arms the moment the apologies were finished. She told him plainly that she did not need him to prove whether he was rich or poor anymore, since that question had already been settled between them long ago. What she needed instead was proof that he could look at her actions and trust them, even when the people around him were offering a far more convenient and suspicious story to believe. Ethan spent the following months proving exactly that. Not through grand gestures or expensive gifts, but through smaller and steadier acts that carried far more weight. He sat quietly beside Grace's hospital bed on nights when there was nothing to say and nothing to fix, simply present because presence mattered more than solutions. He stood in front of people who still whispered about Chloe's past, and corrected them without hesitation, refusing to let old suspicions define the woman he loved. He admitted openly, in front of his own family, every mistake he had made along the way, without shifting blame onto circumstances or onto Chloe herself, understanding at last that real trust required nothing less than full accountability. Together, Ethan and Chloe eventually built a foundation dedicated to supporting people the world too often looked past: tuk-tuk drivers, street vendors, single mothers, and anyone whose hard work rarely earned them the respect it deserved. Ethan kept the old battered tuk-tuk parked outside their new home, refusing every suggestion to replace it with something newer, since it reminded him daily of everything those months of disguise had taught him about how easily wealth could blind a person to another human being's dignity. Chloe took charge of selecting who the foundation would help, drawing on an understanding of genuine hardship that no amount of money could have taught someone who had never lived through it themselves. When Ethan finally proposed, Months after that hospital room had first pulled the last of their secrets into the open, Chloe asked him quietly whether he still wanted to test her one more time. Ethan told her no, explaining that the only person who had truly needed testing from beginning to end had been himself. Their wedding, when it finally happened, was simple rather than extravagant, attended by Grace, Diane, Mr. Kane, and the 3 children who now filled their days with more noise and joy than either of them had ever expected. The old tuk-tuk sat parked near the ceremony itself, a quiet witness to everything that had brought them there. Chloe looked at it and told him she had known his real name from the very first day. Ethan looked back at her and answered that she had been the first person to ever show him who he really was underneath it. If this story reminded you that real love is never about what someone has, but about who they are when nobody's watching, that's a message worth carrying with you. Thank you for staying until the end. And if you want more stories like this one, go ahead and subscribe so the next one finds its way to you too.